All right, guys. So I'm guessing you're at this lesson because you've successfully created your account. You've been able to log into the portal, and then you're seeing a screen that looks similar to this. So I've been doing things in my portal. So I've removed tiles, I've put tiles. So you may not necessarily see the same thing that I have on my screen based on the way your dashboard is laid out. But ultimately, this is where you do land. So from here, you can look at your dashboard. You can actually customize some of these things. You can go over to see what are other resources. You can see all the services that you can access. So the different services allude to the different offerings that you can take advantage of. You can always check out the free services that you have access to. Now, everything you need to accomplish can be accomplished through this portal. There are many options and wizards and tools to help you to accomplish the provisioning of any resource or anything. But then, of course, while it might be easier to do it one time through the wizard, it can become tedious in the long run if it's something that you have to do repeatedly and you have to log into the portal every single time to accomplish it. All right, guys, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to be creating our first virtual machine in Azure. To get this started, what we'll do is jump over to the pills in the top left corner, and then we'll click on create a resource. So once we do that, we're led to this page that gives us some templates, I guess, from the most popular templates. So we could start off with a Windows Server 2019 data center, an Ubuntu VM, and different resources. However, if we want to see all of our options, we could always just go to see more in marketplace, or we could actually filter based on what we might be interested in based on the category. So if I just start filtering here, then I will see that I eventually land on compute, which allows me to create a virtual machine. So it might be that I don't want a Windows 2019 data center rather. I may want a virtual machine with something else. So I can click on virtual machine, and then from here, it allows me to set up what I want. So firstly, I'll choose a subscription. Which subscription do I want this virtual machine under? I only have one. Like we discussed earlier, you might have multiple. You might have a personal one and a company one, or the company may have several. Whichever one, you select the appropriate one. We also need a resource group. Now, a resource group is pretty much like a container for resources that might be related, or that's the way at least I would recommend it's used. That if you have a number of resources relating to one app and they're all related and share things, right, then they should all be in the same resource group. In this situation, I have no resource groups, so I could always just, well, I have one actually. I didn't remember I have that one. That's fine. But I could select an existing one, or I could just allow it to create a new one. So I can just say create new, and we'll call this one test VM1. All right. Once it's in the clear, meaning you don't have two resource groups with the same name, then you can click OK, and then you can move ahead. What's the name of the virtual machine? I'll just call this test VM1. What's my region? So we discussed this earlier that you want to always choose a region that is closest to either you or the customers that you will be serving. Based on my geographical location, East US or East US 2 would be best. I'll just choose East US 2 because that is a newer data center. But of course, you make that decision based on your context. We can choose availability options. So we can choose availability zones, availability set. We can have multiple virtual machines. So that's where that fault tolerance comes in. For this exercise, however, I'll just use one virtual machine. So no redundancy is required. Standard security, I will leave that on standard. And then the image would be, what do I want this virtual machine to have as its operating system? So what happens is that you won't be buying the license, but the price of the license is automatically implied in how much you'll be paying for the virtual machine per use, per month, etc. So you won't have to buy a Windows license up front. No, you don't, but you can pay rent for it. So we can view all images if we're not entirely sure or we're not seeing the option that we want right there. And let's say I wanted Windows Server. So we have Windows Server here under featured. And if you scroll down, you see all the other operating systems. So it's not limited to Windows, right? Of course, we're using .NET Core, which is very much open source and cross-platform. So any one of these that fits your business needs is fair game. if you're considering using a virtual machine to host your .NET Core application. In this case, however, I'm just going to stick to Windows, and then from here I can choose all of the possible images that they have. So they have from Windows Server 2012 all the way up to 2022. Actually, I've not used Windows Server 2022 to this point, so I'm actually going to just do Windows Server 2022. That is the one that I want. All right. So you'd also notice that I have this Gen 2. You saw an option for Gen 1 and Gen 2. Basically, if I click configure VM generation, it will kind of explain the difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2. And it's really just a matter of the support for the underlying hardware that would be virtualized. So you can learn more about that, but I'll stick with Gen 2. And for the size, this is where the real money spending comes in. So they'll estimate how much it will cost per month if you never switch off that machine. So in other words, this D2S underscore version 3 with 2 virtual CPUs, 8 gigs of memory would cost me $70 per month if I never shut it off. Mark you, if I never shut it off. So when we spin it up and everything, I'll show you what that means. Because in the event that I'm using it during the day and then I don't want to use it while I sleep, then I can actually deallocate the machine and I won't be paying for the use of the machine at that time. However, once that machine is allocated, it is going to be in a running state as far as the infrastructure is concerned, and you will be billed for that. So I'm going to stick with the standard for $70 a month. And then we can go to the administrative stuff. So I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm just going to say my username is that, and my password is a nice and easy password to remember. All right, I had to change that password because the security for this is a bit tighter than what I'm used to. That's fine. So I just made it a little longer. And then we can configure the different inbound ports. So I will definitely need to allow RDP. I can also allow HTTP and HTTPS traffic, but for now, I'll just enable RDP, which means I can connect to it when it is spun up. I can also bring my own license, so I can use the Azure hybrid benefit, meaning if I have a license already and I probably don't want to pay the full price of renting the license from them, I can let them know I have a license already and they can work out a shared pricing scheme for me. I don't have one, so I'll just move along. Next, we go over to the disks. So when we're at the disks, we get to choose the operating system disk type. Do we want premium solid state? Do we want standard solid state or standard HDD, right? I'm going to use the standard SSD. It's a bit cheaper. So please note that what you're paying for the virtual machine is different sometimes than what you'll be paying for storage and other networking resources. So they all combine. So even though you see $70 a month, it might end up being a little more, or maybe more like $80 or $90 a month, given all the related resources that are needed for that virtual machine. So the disk is no exception. So with that done, what I'll do is continue to networking. And then here, I need to set up a virtual network. So this is where I actually got into networking a bit, because I don't like networking innately, right? Um, when we talk about a virtual network, it's just going to spin up the underlying infrastructure to quote unquote fake a network. It's going to give you the subnetting, going to give you the IP address on that virtual network, and then you can give it a network interface card, which of course is a virtual card that represents like your Ethernet port or whatever port connects your machine to the network. So everything is done right here for you. And you can also choose load balancing. So if you have more than one virtual machines and you want to do that load balancing scenario, where traffic hits either machine at any given time, you can easily configure that here. Keeping it simple though, let's jump over to management, which is really just going to talk about boot diagnostics, guest OS, identity. I'm not going to really change anything here. Here's a very good feature that was introduced maybe in the not so distant past, where we can enable auto shutdown. So you can choose to shut down your machine at X time every single day. You can also choose to be notified about the shutdown. So this feature basically would help you with cost saving. If it's a case where it's a test machine like it is now, then you don't need to be running it 24/7. So you can always just enable shutdown, auto shutdown. In case you forgot to shut down and deallocate, it will do it for you. You can also enable disaster recovery and other options. So I'm not spending too much time on those because those are pretty standard unless you have very specific needs. You can put on extensions, put in some custom data, put on tags. But at this point, these are more like rudimentary tags. That's to help you to identify the machine. But then at the end of the day, we want to get to the review and recreate, where they just give us everything about the machine all at once for us to review, and it will give you a nice little flag to let you know that all your settings can work. They even give you the by the hour charge. So you'll be paying 9 cents, roughly 10 cents per hour with this machine. All right, so you can just go ahead and review everything. You can go back. You can also download a template for automation, which is really just a JSON file. So this JSON file will outline every single parameter, every single setting that we just set up, that we just selected rather. We can download this and store it for later. We can do a deployment at any point when we bring it back. We can do a number of things with this template. So you see that Azure is heavily supporting automation, right? Anyhow, let me come out of the template and I'll just continue with the wizard. So I'll just go ahead and click create. Now this may take a few minutes. So in the next lesson when we come back, the VM should have been created as well as all the resources. And then we'll look at how we connect to and interact with it. All right, so we're back and our virtual machine has been created. So at the end of the creation process, I'm sure you saw an option that said go to virtual machine. And even though you went there, it probably was not ready. You probably saw a flag. But either way, if you were to just navigate away from the from that page back to the dashboard, you'd be able to see that all resources has every single resource that you had to create. You can actually see more just to make sure that you have the full list. These are all the resources that had to be created with the resource group for the test VM. All right. You could probably have named this a bit better, so it said test VM dash RG or something to suggest resource group. But my point is that these are all the resources that had to get created just now to support one virtual machine. So if I click on the virtual machine itself, it brings me to this management page, which you would have seen if you went to the virtual machine after creation, and then you're able to connect. So to connect, you would choose RDP, which basically gives you the ability to download this RDP file and allows you to connect to this public IP address for your virtual machine. So going back to overview, if you just look through, you'd see under the networking area, you have the public IP address. Now that is another resource that you will be paying for. So by the end of us doing this, I'm going to show you how to deallocate the virtual machine and turn off the public IP to minimize the costs you would incur when you're not using these resources. So once again, if we go to connect and say RDP, we can download that RDP file, open it, and then it will bring up the RDP that is on your machine. When you click connect, it will prompt you for the credentials for that virtual machine. So that means I have to be careful what I type in here as a username. So my username would have to be the public IP address backslash or forward slash, not entirely sure which one that is, but then we put in the username that we had selected, and then we put in the password that we had used. So the importance of this is that we are on our own network on our own machine. The domain on our machine is different from the domain on the virtual machine. So you have to make sure you represent the domain that the virtual machine can recognize, which is at this point its own IP address, the username, and then we put in the password. When we click OK, we're then prompted to accept the certificate, and then it will allow us to connect. And there we go. We're now connected to the virtual machine. All right. So that's pretty much all there is to setting up a virtual machine. And these virtual machines give you the opportunity to explore different operating systems and test the features of different operating systems that you probably might not be able to from your current context. But as you can see, it's just another virtual machine that starts off as basic as possible. You can configure it how you want to configure it and set up all the applications, everything you want, just another virtual machine. And you can save that RDP file. Well, it's already saved because you downloaded it, and you can reuse it every time. Now, what I'm going to show you is how we can remove or turn off this machine properly to make sure that it's not going to incur as much cost when we're not using it. So if I close this, that's fine. We'll just close that session. You see that you have the opportunity to stop. Now, the difference between stop and shut down, right? If we were still connected, I just disconnected, but you can always shut down a machine, a Windows machine normally, or any machine for that matter. You can just shut it down. Shutting down is different from deallocating, because even though you shut down the operating system, the machine itself is still running once you see the stop button clickable. So when we want to deallocate the machine, we have to make sure that we click stop. So I'm going to stop this machine at this moment, and then they're going to ask, do you want to reserve the public IP? Because it's no guarantee that you'll get it back, right? So that's another thing. If you choose to preserve the public IP address, then you will be charged for reserving it, right? If you choose not to reserve it, then the next time you start the machine, you're going to get a different public IP address. So at that point, you might end up getting an RDP file for every time you change the IP address, because then that connecting address would change, right? So you can decide which one is more important, whether you want to keep the public IP address so that you can use one RDP file, or in the long run, if you're actually using this machine and connecting to this machine actively, then you may want to just reserve it, because you may have other services that need to see that public IP address. Either way, I personally, and for this lesson, I have no attachment to that public IP address. So I'll just go ahead and stop it without reserving. Click OK. And once that stopping action has been completed, you notice that you would be able to click start. So you would have to click start in order to reconnect. Now, while we're here, I want to point out that you have many different options. You can adjust the size of the virtual machine on the fly. So maybe the one that you provisioned, you need more juice, you need more space, whatever. You can always upsize, scale it out. So upsizing would be scaling vertically, meaning you're making the machine bigger, whereas scaling horizontally means that you're providing more virtual machines within the same set to do more load balancing. So you have different options. Once again, your context determines what you do. Under monitoring, you'd see that you have some key metrics. So they show you different things that you can also pin to the dashboard, which means that you can actually see that whenever you log in and go to the dashboard. So you'll see that. So like I said, the dashboard will come to life, and everybody's dashboard may end up looking differently based on what they want to see. So that's really it for how we provision a VM using the wizard, how we connect to it. And at this point, I'm really just going to scrub my account of everything that was created for this virtual machine. So the easiest way to do that, and this is why it's always a good idea to have the resource group having things that are always related. Let's say I'm finished with this virtual machine. I don't want anything related to it. So the network interface, or the NIC that was created, the network security group, the virtual network, the public IP address that has been reserved for me, I don't want any of those things. I can just delete the entire resource group. So let me go back. If you look carefully, most things here are clickable. And once it's clickable, you can jump directly to that resource. So by clicking the resource group, I can jump directly to the resource group, which is showing me all of the resources listed out. I can just choose all of them, or rather, the easiest way would be to delete the resource group. So if I delete the resource group, it's going to ask me if I'm sure I want to delete it, because everything here will also be deleted. And to confirm deletion, I need to retype this name, which I do, then click delete. Now, that procedure may take a little time, so I'm going to jump back over to the dashboard. And well, my own was completed, or at least it's reporting that it was completed successfully. So at the end of it, I'm seeing a few resources here. If I go to test VM1, which I know was in that resource group, you'll see here that I can't do anything because technically it really doesn't exist, right? So it will soon be delisted at least. And then the network watcher, that was in a different resource group. So I would have to remove that one manually, which once again is as easy as just going to delete the resource group, which has that network watcher service, taking the name, making sure it's put there, and deleting. All right, so that one is done. And if we click all resources, even though we see resources here, if I click all resources, I'm still just seeing that one storage account that was created for the cloud shell storage. So that's fine. So when we come back, we will look at how we can do that, repeat those steps of creating the virtual machine using the cloud shell. All right, guys, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at creating the VM and the related resources using the command line interface. So to get to the command line interface while in the dashboard, you can always just click on that cloud shell, if you recall, and that will bring up the bash/PowerShell interface for us. So I'm actually going to switch over to PowerShell. Reason being, more than likely you're using a Windows machine, and I think PowerShell is a bit more intuitive. So we'll just wait for it to do those preliminary checks, and then we're here, right? So we can use the get module az star dash list available to see all of our available commands. Remember that we did that when we set up PowerShell on our machines. So if you didn't set up PowerShell on your machine, but you want to use PowerShell, well, here's where you can do that. So let us check out how we create a resource group. If you want this bigger, you can always maximize, and so it fills more of the screen. So I'm going to say new dash az resource, and if I press tab, it will kind of list out the completion for me, right? So if you start typing and you're not entirely sure what the command looks like, you just press tab and it will kind of give you a little, its version of IntelliSense. So what I really want is the new AZ resource group. So I can just continue typing and then press tab. When it's sure that that's the only thing that could possibly be there, it will autocomplete. At that point, I am going to say dash resource group name, and once again you just press tab for it to autocomplete. And this one I'm going to put in quotation marks. I'm going to call it test dash VM 1-RG, and I'll call this one VM2, right? Well, probably I can say VM CLI, so it's clear that this is the CLI one, right? So RG is just what I said in the initial one, that I should have probably tagged it as RG, so we're clear that this is the resource group. Anyhow, next is location. So I want this resource group to live in the region East US 2. All right. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you need to commit all these things to memory. Sometimes you'll have to go back and see what the command is or what the values are, like what the region, the proper location short codes are. You'll have to check on those things. But eventually, practice makes permanent. And once again, you have if you write the script, it's repeatable. So you don't have to keep on checking it every single time. Anyhow, once I press enter, that will actually go ahead and create that resource group in East US2 for me, and everything that I need is now provided. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is get the credentials, or create a credentials object that I'm going to use to give the virtual machine as the user that it should be set up with, right? So all you have to do is say $cred, which is basically just a variable. So I'm declaring a variable, $cred, or credential, whatever you want to call it, is equal to get credential. So once I do that and press enter, it will ask me for the credentials. So I'm going to use the same credentials I used last time. Try and get a strong password in there. And then that is my credential object created for me. So now I can move on to creating the new virtual machine. So I can now say new dash az and then press tab if I'm not sure. Display all 1229 possibilities. Nah, I'm not going to do that one. What I'll do is just finish it up. So azvm, And then inside of that, you have the resource group name. What's the resource group name? We know because we just created it. So it's test VM CLI RG. And here's the completed statement. So for each of the parameters, of course, you have the values. So let's just go from the top. Resource group name, I gave it the name. I tried to append CLI to every name so that we're sure. So resource group name, name of the machine itself, the location, which is East US 2 for me, the virtual network name, which is test vnet CLI, the subnet name. So here it gives us the ability to name every single element that we know needs to get created. And just by naming it here, what it will do is actually scaffold those resources for us because it knows it needs them for the virtual machine also. In other situations, maybe have them existing. You, of course, would want the new virtual machine on an existing VNet and subnet, etc. You can go ahead and use the existing resource names instead of putting names of resources that don't yet exist. So up to the point where we get to the public IP address name, kind of chops off. So it's test PIP, public IP, CLI, and then the credential object is passed in for the credential parameter, right? So remember that we just created that credential up top here. So once I do all of that and press enter, it is letting me know that no size was explicitly stated. So once again, as many parameters as you put in, it will know. Otherwise, it will kind of assume certain things. So it will just assume that I wanted the default standard one, which is what we created last time through the wizard. So we can leave it for a bit and let it go ahead and create what it needs to. And that didn't take too long at all. So now I can close this command shell. And when I go back to my dashboard, I now see all the resources that I didn't click through the wizard. I just wrote maybe 4, 5 lines, and we can see all those resources created for us, right? Of course, once again, the more information you put into the script is the more targeted and refined the decisions will be when the script is executed. Whatever details we fail to put in, Azure is just going to assume and put in the defaults that it knows about anyway. So we already looked at how to connect to the virtual machine and everything, so I won't go into that again. Notice we got a different public IP. If you committed the previous one to memory, you notice that there's a different one. But let's jump back over to our CLI and see some other commands that we could run that could be helpful. So if I wanted to stop the virtual machine that's currently running via script, I could say stop -azvm, and then I would provide the name of the virtual machine that I wish to stop. So stop -azvm -name test vmcli, and then of course it would just ask me to confirm the resource group name. So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to do Control-C, and I'm going to show you that I could have actually done that all in one command. So I could say the name of the machine is that, and the resource group name is test-vmcli-rg. And then it says that it will be stopped. Do you want to continue? Yes, I do. Then I press enter. And once it is successfully stopped, you will see that prompt come up. And starting it is just as easy. You just have to say start -azvm instead of stop with the same parameters. So everything you can do in the wizard, you can do in the command prompt. So what I'm going to do is tear down this entire resource group, right? So I'm going to say remove -az resource, and if I press tab twice, I'm going to see that I have the options. Okay, so resource group, tab, completed. Then this one requires a name. And then, of course, we give it the name. And then we finish off that statement with a force. So that means I don't care what this resource group is doing. I don't care what resources might be locked up. I want it deleted. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this by force. And at the end of that operation is going to return true. So I think that's a nice, clear enough indication of it completing, right? So if I go back to my dashboard and I look at all my resources, I'm going to notice that I only have the network watcher resource group left. So to remove that one, same procedure, same principle. But you would also notice that unlike the last time when I had lingering resources and Actually, it's when I closed the browser, came back, they disappeared. This time they're all gone. Not that it's really that big of a deal, but just to show you how much more quickly the script might act than using the web interface, right? So if I want, I can just go ahead and remove the network watcher also, which I will do. And in similar fashion, once that completes, we see true. So after refreshing, I see that I'm back to just my storage account needed for my PowerShell or my CLI shell for Azure. So that's really it for how the scripts help you to do certain tasks more quickly and at least repeat them more efficiently in the long run. Hey guys, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can create the Azure Virtual Machine, but we're using the Bash scripting this time. So in the previous video, we looked at it with PowerShell and we discussed that you can do it from here in the portal, or you can get the PowerShell libraries installed locally. So we're going to similarly use the terminal here in the portal, but if you wanted to do it locally, then you would want to secure the Azure CLI tools that you could download and install locally on your machine. So here you see I just have the download screen that I went and found azure.microsoft.com and downloads, and you'll see here that you have all the tools and the SDKs that you can get. Let us proceed, however, in our portal, and we're going to use the terminal here. So I bring up the terminal and you see I have a few more resources. I've been busy. So now I'm going to bring up that Bash terminal, not PowerShell this time. So we see here, and we kind of looked at it already, that we can type help, get an idea of what is possible. If we type AZ, we can just see all of the potential commands that we can do, but then the logical steps follow regardless of which pattern we're using, whether we're using the wizard or we're using PowerShell or we're using the bash scripting. The pattern of the resources being created follows, right? So the first thing that we have to do, following the example of our, let me just clear this. Sorry, I wrote CLS. That should have been clear. So following the example of what we just did with our PowerShell, we're going to go through the same steps. So I'm going to start off by saying AZ and then group, create. So the first thing I need to do is create my resource group, and then I'm going to give it a double dash and parameter name, and then give it, so I'm going to say test VM bash dash RG, right? That's the name, and then I give it the location, which would be east US as we know. So once I do that, it's going to tell me now that, okay, yes, I've created that resource group for you at that location. All right, that's good progress. Now that we have our resource group, we can proceed to fill out what we want about the virtual machine to go in the resource group. So I can say AZVM create, and then I can start listing out parameters now. So dash dash, and then I'll say resource hyphen group. Okay, so when you press tab, it kind of finishes it for you, but there was actually a delay, which is why you saw it appear and I was still typing. So I would definitely want to reuse that name, of course. So test dash VM dash bash dash RG. That is our resource group. And then our name. What is the name of the virtual machine? I'm just going to say test dash VM dash bash, or test dash bash dash VM, right? The image, what do I want to use? I'm going to use the Windows 9 2019 data center. So you're probably wondering, where am I getting these values from? Well, it's well documented actually. If you go to Microsoft Docs and look for the latest documentation on Azure CLI commands, you'll see every single command possible. And of course, when you drill into the command, it is going to show you the potential commands that you can run, the way that the commands could look, and the different parameters you can use. And you can access the same kind of documentation for PowerShell. So while we're just doing examples, what I'm doing might not necessarily align with what you need, but here are the resources. Use them and you can accomplish many things. All right. So let's jump back over to the dashboard. So I'm using that Windows 2019 data center image. I'm going to tell it that, yes, I want a public dash IP dash SKU, and I'm just going to say standard. So I want the standard pricing for the public IP that it's going to provision for me. And then I'm going to give it the admin hyphen username, and I'll just use my name. And then I'll press enter. Now it's going to ask for the password. That's fine. So I'll provide that and confirm. All right. And then now you see that it's running. So let's give that a few seconds. And there we go. So now we have some form of indication that our machine now exists. Let's run and look at this resource that has been created for us. I went to all services, but I should be going to all resources, not all services. So let me minimize that. And then I'm going to see all of those new resources associated with the virtual machine. So similarly, that is how we could provision our virtual machine using bash scripting. And of course, you have other commands. And once again, it's preference. If you prefer bash, then you might enjoy this a bit more than the PowerShell. But if you live in PowerShell, then you might feel more at home. But as you can see, they're both just interfaces for interacting with the ARM APIs, ARM Azure Resource Manager, right? So if I wanted to say open up a port, right? So I could say AZVM open port, and then I indicate which port I would want to open. So let's say from commands, I wanted to open up port 80 so you can receive regular web traffic. Then I would have to indicate which resource group I would want. So I could just start typing that. And then I would indicate the name of that resource group, of course, and then the name of the machine, which we know already. So I'm just showing you that those are things that you can accomplish using bash scripting, and scripting is great for automation. All right, guys, in this lesson, we're going to look at deploying ARM templates. So ARM is an acronym that stands for Azure Resource Manager. And this is the code name for the engine that sits underneath everything that we're seeing, whether it's the PowerShell commands, the bash scripting, the portal, whatever tools, all of them really communicate with this ARM construct. And that is what is really pulling the strings. So we have what we call ARM templates, which means that they have the predefined JSON with all of the values and all of the parameters needed to provision certain resources. And using these templates, we could actually just kind of mass deploy things that look identical, or machines that look identical, or resources that look identical, whatever your needs are. So all of that to say that I'm here on the templates page, and you see the URL here, azure.microsoft.com, resources, templates, and we're looking at VM simple Windows. So you have the simple Windows virtual machine template. But if you look at the templates page, you see that you have a few other things that you could actually just get the ARM template for. So sometimes you want to deploy something, you're not sure of the commands, you're not necessarily sure of all the configurations and so on. Well, these are templates that are predefined, whether they're done by Microsoft or by third parties who are contributing to it. But maybe they did something looking like this, and they generated that JSON file and are sharing it in an open community. So you as a consumer can actually just come and take one of these templates and then deploy it. So we're going to look at one from Microsoft, and that is the simple, well, not really from Microsoft. Here you see it's from Brian Moore. I'm not sure if he's a Microsoft employee or not, but it's to deploy a simple Windows virtual machine. So we can actually look at it on the GitHub repository. And if you feel more safe about that, Azure themselves, that's the Microsoft team, is maintaining this repository, and they have all sorts of templates here. All right. So let us take a look at that. So deploying it, I'm sure you noticed that you could just click deploy to Azure here, right? If you went to the GitHub, you notice that they also provide that here, and they have different options based on the different subscription types. So obviously we don't have a government subscription, or at least I don't, so I wouldn't use this. You can visualize, you can just do deploy. You can look at the other templates, like maybe quick start templates, And that just brings you right back here to other kind of templates that you can look at to get it started, right? So I'm going to keep it simple. Let's deploy a simple Windows virtual machine, and I'm just going to click deploy to Azure, which would do the same thing as the deploy to Azure that we saw in the GitHub repository, right? So whichever one you click should amount to the same thing. It's going to open a new tab. It's going to ask you to authenticate. Once you do that, it's going to bring you to the wizard with all of the values predefined as per that template. So you see here, it knows that it's going to be spinning up 6 resources. You can edit the template at this point, and this allows you to actually interact with that JSON file. So you can put in your own username, you can put in your own password at that stage. If you, I mean, you obviously wouldn't want to put in probably username and password. You would probably want to do that on the fly for different machines. But you can put in your virtual machine name if you want. All of those things you can modify in the file before it actually gets deployed. So if I go back, all I have to do now is just change a few things. Like my region would be East US 2. I put in my admin username and password, and we're already familiar with that. And pretty much we've gone through the wizard, so we should be familiar with all of the different steps that are being seen here. And this would be a standard DS2 as per the documentation. I would also want to create a resource group. I'm just going to use the same bash resource group because I haven't removed it as yet. All right, and then I can give it the name. So I'll leave it as simple VM or simple. Let me just make it known that this is an ARM VM. Then we can review just to make sure that our validations pass. And this is an essential step because if you modify the document, then you might have messed up something in the document and it might not pass the validation. So once we know that everything is still valid, whether we modify the document or we just filled in the blank spaces, because once again, it is just a template. So even if you're doing a mass deployment, you'd want to fit in those values and then you generate per resource or per set of resources accordingly. But we can go ahead and click create. I'm not going to create because I think we know what happens after you click create. What I really just wanted to show you was the fact that you have this resource or have access to these resources called templates. And these templates can help you to spin up an environment or a particular set of resources very quickly with a few adjustments. And you can see all and you can look through and see what you might need for your situation at that time.